Peppa Pig, the disappearing parents. One evening, while Peppa and George were having dinner, Mummy and Daddy Pig were unusually quiet. Normally they laughed and told stories, but tonight they just sat there, staring at their plates. "Mummy, are you okay?" Peppa asked. "Yes, sweetie," Mummy Pig replied, but her voice sounded hollow. "Daddy, tell us a joke," George asked, but Daddy Pig only gave him a strange look before looking away. That night was only the beginning. The next morning, Mummy Pig didn't make breakfast. Peppa found her standing by the window in the kitchen, unmoving as though deep in thought. "Mummy, are you looking for something?" Peppa asked. Mummy Pig turned around, but her gaze was empty. "Everything will be fine, sweetie," she said before turning back to the window. That evening, Daddy Pig came home late. When he arrived, he looked strange. His clothes were dirty, and he offered no explanation. "Where were you?" Mummy Pig asked, but Daddy just shrugged and sat at the table. The following night, Peppa and George were awakened by strange noises. They heard Mummy and Daddy talking in the living room, but their voices sounded unnatural, as if someone was imitating them. Peppa crept downstairs and peeked into the living room. Her parents stood motionless, staring at a single point on the wall. Their shadows seemed to move on their own, writhing across the floor. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa whispered. Her parents turned to her at the same time, their faces stretched into eerie, unnatural smiles. "Go back to bed, Peppa," they said in unison. The next day, Mummy Pig was gone. Her purse was on the table and her phone lay on the floor. Daddy Pig seemed calm and said, "She just stepped out." "Don't worry." But by nightfall, Daddy Pig had disappeared too, leaving Peppa and George alone in the house. That night, they heard noises again. Peeking into the living room, they saw their parents. But their faces were unrecognizable, black, empty eyes, grotesquely wide smiles, and their skin had turned gray. "You're not our Mummy and Daddy," Peppa screamed, grabbing George's hand. Her parents started moving toward them. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, and strange hissing sounds came from their mouths. "Why are you trying to run?" Daddy Pig said, his voice deep and distorted. "We're just getting started," Mummy Pig added, stretching her arms toward them. Suddenly their shadows grew massive, consuming the entire room. Mummy and Daddy Pig began smashing furniture, their bodies twisting at impossible angles, as if they were no longer human. Peppa and George tried to escape, but their parents blocked the way. "We'll stay a family forever," they said in unison. The mysterious shadow. One evening, as Peppa and her family were preparing for dinner, the house started to grow dark faster than usual. Daddy Pig turned on the living room light, but the bulb immediately went out, leaving the room in semi-darkness. Soon, the lights in the whole house started to dim, and Peppa felt that something was wrong. Mummy Pig tried to turn on other lights, but without success. Peppa suggested opening the windows to let in some light, but when they did, there was nothing visible outside. No yard, no familiar trees, just endless darkness. Peppa closed the window, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. Daddy Pig suggested they go outside and see what was happening. But as soon as he opened the door, the entire house was suddenly plunged into complete darkness. Peppa, Mummy, and Daddy stood in the dark hallway, hearing only each other's footsteps and a faint rustling sound. Then Peppa noticed a strange shadow moving across the walls. At first, she thought it was just the play of light, but the shadow became clearer and more unnatural. Peppa tried to call out to her parents, but they didn't respond, their faces empty. The shadow began to move closer, and Peppa felt her heart tighten with fear. She tried to find the light switch, but couldn't remember where it was. At that moment, the shadow appeared right in front of her. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a creature with huge, soulless eyes and a twisted body. Peppa screamed in terror, and at that moment, the light flickered back on. The shadow disappeared, as if it had never been there. But Peppa couldn't forget what she had seen. When she returned to her parents, they seemed just like usual, but something about their behavior was strange. They didn't notice how quickly it had gotten dark, nor were they concerned about the lights going out. Peppa decided she had to stay on guard. And though everything returned to normal, at night in her room, she often saw strange shadows sliding across the walls, sometimes moving as though they were watching her. Peppa Pig. Something is wrong with Peppa. One rainy morning, Peppa woke up earlier than usual. Her room seemed normal, but something felt off. She looked in the mirror and noticed her reflection appeared strange, slightly distorted. Maybe it's just my imagination, she thought, and went down for breakfast. Throughout the day, Peppa noticed her friends acting differently. Susie, usually cheerful, kept her distance and barely spoke to her. During playtime, Susie finally said, "You look strange today." Peppa frowned but didn't reply. Later, while playing in the yard, she caught her reflection in a puddle. Her eyes seemed darker, and her smile was unnervingly wide, almost creepy. She blinked and the reflection looked normal again. By evening, her family started noticing changes in her behavior. Peppa was unusually quiet, no longer laughing, and her occasional smiles seemed unsettling. "Are you feeling okay, dear?" Mummy Pig asked at dinner. "Yes, Mummy," Peppa replied, but her voice sounded lower and stranger than usual. Late that night, George woke up to strange whispers coming from Peppa's room. He tiptoed to her door and peeked inside. She was standing in front of her mirror, whispering something, but her reflection wasn't moving in sync. It seemed alive, moving on its own. "Peppa?" George asked, his voice trembling. She slowly turned toward him, and for a brief moment, her eyes glowed red. "Go back to bed, George," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. The next day, things got even worse. Peppa became aggressive, breaking George's toys and ripping books. She seemed to enjoy it, laughing in a hoarse, chilling tone that made Mummy and Daddy Pig exchange worried glances. Later that night, loud noises came from Peppa's room. Her parents rushed upstairs to find her standing by the window. She didn't move, but her shadow on the wall writhed and twisted as if it had a life of its own. "Peppa, what are you doing?" Mummy Pig asked, her voice shaking. "I'm not Peppa," she said, turning slowly. Her eyes were completely black, and her smile was unnaturally wide. The next morning, the house was empty. No one knew what had happened to Mummy, Daddy, or George. The camera slowly panned to the kitchen, where Peppa sat alone at the table. She smiled, her eyes still dark and empty. Peppa Pig. George has changed. One evening, Peppa's family was having dinner together. George looked tired and barely played with his dinosaur, which was unusual for him. "George, are you okay?" Peppa asked. "Yes," he said quietly, but his voice sounded strange, as though it came from far away. "He's probably just tired," Mummy Pig said. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint whisper coming from their room. She looked over at George and saw him sitting on his bed, staring at the wall. "George, what are you doing?" she asked. "They're calling me," he whispered without turning his head. The next morning, George was acting even stranger. He didn't want to play, didn't eat breakfast, and refused to answer questions. Peppa noticed that his eyes looked darker and his skin appeared pale. "Mummy, what's wrong with George?" Peppa asked. "He just needs some rest," Mummy Pig replied. But Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, Peppa heard the whispering again. This time it was louder, and she could make out the words, "Come to us, come to us." She turned to George's bed, but it was empty. His bed was neatly made, but his dinosaur toy lay on the floor, torn to pieces. "George, where are you?" Peppa called out. She crept downstairs and found George in the living room. He was standing in the center of the room, illuminated by the moonlight. Around him, the shadows on the floor seemed to move as if they were alive. "George," Peppa called again, her voice trembling. He turned to her, smiling in a way she had never seen before. "I'm not George anymore," he said in a low, raspy voice. Peppa tried to run, but the doors to the house were locked. George followed her slowly, his shadow on the walls growing larger and more distorted. She noticed his hands were changing. His fingers had grown long and claw-like, and his eyes were now completely black. "You'll change too, Peppa," he whispered, his voice echoing from every corner of the house. Peppa hid in her room and locked the door. But the shadows under the door began to seep into the room like thick, dark smoke. Soon George was outside her door, his voice a soft whisper. "Don't be afraid, sister. It doesn't hurt." The door creaked open, and in that moment, Peppa glanced at the mirror. Her reflection was different. Her eyes were now black, and her face twisted into a sinister smile.